Hello and welcome to tonight's talk on the quaternity. The quaternity represents a constellation of 4 elements which are connected in a meaningful way. This does not mean that this is some sort of rational framework or some sort of logical constellation, but it's more a meaningful assembly of elements which helps us understand the world we live in. Now, the first quaternity we know of is the Tetracus of Pythagoras. This constellation represented a pyramid, a structure which began at a monad, at a unity, which split into a polarity of 2 elements, which in turn split into a trichotomy of 3 elements to end at a constellation of 4. As the word tetra, 4, suggests in its name, the focus is on the tetrad, on the constellation of 4. It was said about the Tetrakys that it represented on one hand the Oracle of Delphi, and on the other hand a kind of source of meaning and being in the world we live in. Continuing, we have the quaternity of the 4 elements. On one hand, we got water. Second, we got air. Third, we got earth. And fourth, we've got fire. One thing that's not maybe directly clear is that one of these elements is the odd one out. Whilst water, air, and earth represent a harmonious constellation in nature, fire seems to be a departing element. It seems to be that which is destructive. It seems to be that which is potentially an invention by humans and not just found in nature, or something that comes about through a sudden rupture like a lightning, and not something that comes about gradually. Oftentimes in stories, fire is the element of evil. It is the element of the departing nature. Interestingly enough, when investigating alchemical scripts, one can find such notion about the 4 elements or the 4th elements quite frequently. The psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung investigated alchemical texts as he regarded alchemy as a sort of preliminary stage to modern science, where body and spirit were not entirely separate yet, and one could affect the other. So for example, in astrology, elements of the human world could be seen in the stars. In the same way, in alchemy, elements of human life could be seen in chemical substances. What Jung observed in his patients was that many had dreams in which a constellation of 3 colors occurred. These 3 colors would be joined by a 4th one whenever the therapy was successful and the disbalance was reconciled. In the same way, fire represents a disbalance. Whenever fire occurs, destruction happens, disbalance happens, but it is necessary for the entirety of the cosmos, which is held together by the quaternity. Meaning the departing element is part of the quaternity. It is not clear exactly what the nature of the 4th element is and why exactly the 4th element is departing, but it can be understood through further investigation. If we start with a regular polarity, let's say with no particular meaning, arrow up and arrow down, and we seek for that which is in between, which unites these two elements, we may find a sort of uniting principle. One can stop here. However, there seems to be something we are silent about in this case. We are silent about the fourth element, which is the inversion of the unifying principle. In this case, the fourth element is arriving, whilst in the quaternity of the four elements, the fourth element was departing. This mirrors this development. So the unifying principle, the harmonious principle of a trinity, as we also know it in Christianity, seems to be silent about its fourth element. In this case, Jung also speaks that the fourth element is an evil feminine principle, because the Trinity includes the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, but it doesn't include matter and evil. How can such an important character as, for example, the devil or Mother Mary or other such figures not be represented? This goes to show that the fourth element can't be Lucifer and Mary and matter at the same time. So there's potentially multiple quaternities. So quaternities are not necessarily a distinct rational system. We can't arrive at the one quaternity that the Trinity is silent about. But it goes to show the nature of the departing and arriving fourth principle. Now, one could think that this is a principle that applies to religions and mystical traditions and may not be really found in modern scientific contexts. However, in modern science, you do have such a thing as four fundamental forces. And the interesting thing in this case is that three of the forces, namely electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, are unified or can be unified in the Standard Model. They can be unified in a sort of unifying quantum theory, whereas the fourth force, namely gravity, seems to be departing. It seems to be something that can't be unified and requires a different departing theory in order to be explained. In the same way, space-time functions where three dimensions are represented by space and one dimension by time, and it seems that one of the four dimensions is somehow different in its nature, as we perceive time in a different way than we perceive space. Now, looking at this constellation, there is fundamental philosophical properties one can win from this as well. One can talk about a potential ontological quaternity. Now, what would an ontological quaternity look like? In this case, the top element could be represented by being, and the bottom element by nothingness or not being. In between, we've got the element of becoming, meaning coming into being, and unbecoming, meaning going out of being. And this represents a cycle, namely a distinctly temporal cycle. The understanding of being, or the sense of being we seem to encounter in the world, is a sense that is tied to our sense of time. So beings appear to become, unbecome, and cease to be. This mirrors a development that could be seen as the first archaic encounter with time. Namely, nothingness was given by the night. It was the time in which nothing could be perceived. Being could be seen as day. And becoming is the sunrise, and unbecoming the sun set. This can be seen as a sort of archetypal temporal quaternity. Now, what Martin Heidegger suggested as a sort of corresponding complementary quaternity is a more worldly or spatial quaternity. This quaternity suggested by Heidegger, named the Geviert, represented that which would bring together the opposites in which the world had been split through rational thinking and technology. This sort of overcoming or Verwindung of technology would be given by what he called das Ereignis, which is the event which assembles the quaternity. The quaternity that is assembled by the event, by the Ereignis, is given by the sky, the earth, humans, and gods. Thus, a sense of temporality still exists where humans are mortals, humans are bound in time, and gods are immortal. It represents something that opens up the world in between earth and sky in which humans and gods live. This seems to represent a sort of primordial mythical understanding of the world in terms of a quaternity, which maybe had not been necessarily explicitly expressed like that, but many primitive cultures, many archaic cultures can be seen to have some sort of representation that aligns with this quaternity. Now, the quaternity is not necessarily something that can be applied everywhere. There is not 4 elements to be found in every place, and whenever one gets too deep into a concept like that, one tends to see quaternities everywhere, not necessarily something that means something or has some sort of significance. But it can help us to find a new framework that's not necessarily purely logical, but something where the elements kind of assemble as they do in the event by themselves and not through some sort of rigid, formalized structure. I hope this video was informative, and I'll see you next time.
Life behaves a bit as if